It happened on a night that most history books barely mention. A night swallowed by smoke, silence, and a kind of fear that made grown men tremble. A night when 12 soldiers, just 12, stood in the path of an armored fist made of more than 300 German tanks. A night that should have ended in minutes, but didn't. A night when everything changed. But to understand what these 12 men did, you first have to understand what the world believed about the Maginot Line. For years, the French government promised its people that the Maginot Line was unbreakable. A steel spine buried deep into the earth, stretching hundreds of kilometers, and designed to stop the German war machine dead. It was the symbol of France's safety, the reassurance that the nightmares of the First World War would never return. But concrete doesn't feel fear. Concrete also doesn't feel betrayal. And when the war finally arrived in 1940, it wasn't the concrete that held the line. It was the men inside it. In a small fortification complex known as Ouvrage La Ferté, 12 French soldiers were stationed. Most were barely older than 20. A few had wives. One had a newborn daughter he'd only held once. Their orders were simple. Hold the position until reinforcements arrive. Reinforcements that would never come. By early May, Germany had swept through Belgium, bypassed the strongest Maginot sectors, and begun encircling them. It was a brilliant strategy, deadly, fast, and unexpected. Most French units were collapsing, retreating, or surrendering. But La Ferté stood in their way, alone, isolated, and surrounded by silence that felt heavier than the steel doors behind them. On the night of May 17th, thunder rolled in from the north. Only, it wasn't thunder, it was engines. Tracks grinding on earth, the metallic growl of a mechanized horde, 300 tanks, 300. When the first shells began landing, the ground shook like it was alive. Dust fell from the ceiling. Metal screamed. Inside, the 12 men strapped on their helmets. Their commander, Lieutenant Bourguignon, whispered, "Stand firm, we hold." But he didn't sound like an officer anymore. He sounded like a man who had just accepted that he might die. The Germans expected an easy kill. But the Maginot Line had been built with tunnels, rotating turrets, underground barracks, ammunition stores, reinforced gun chambers. La Ferté might have been small, maybe the smallest of all the ouvrages. But in the right hands, it was a monster. And those 12 men, they made it roar. They fired anti-tank rounds until the chambers smoked white. They turned their machine guns toward the advancing armor columns and stitched burning metal across German formations. For every tank that approached, another shell left the French turret. 2 hours passed. Then 3. The Germans were forced to pull back and regroup. It was unthinkable. 12 men stopping what entire divisions had failed to slow. But the cost was already apparent. Ventilation systems had been damaged. Smoke was filling the lower levels. They could hardly breathe. Outside, the Germans adjusted their strategy. They rolled forward again, this time with flamethrowers and heavy artillery designed to crush fortifications from above. Explosions slammed the metal turrets so hard the hinges buckled. Fire poured into the air vents, turning clean air into poison. Still, they refused to surrender. Survivors from other units would later say, "All night, we saw La Ferté burning, but it did not fall." By dawn, the tanks surrounded the fort from all sides. Columns of smoke twisted into the sky. Inside, the men were choking, coughing, collapsing one by one. The ventilation was gone. The exits were cut off. Still no reinforcements. Still no orders to retreat. The last message transmitted from La Ferté was barely audible through static. A voice, hoarse tired, fading, said, "Turret in flames, impossible to leave, still holding." They held until they physically could no longer lift weapons, until the air inside the fort turned toxic, until the fire, the fumes, and the collapsing structure took the final decision from them. La Ferté fell silent. When French forces reached the fort days later, they found all 12 men still at their posts. Some still had their hands on their weapons. Not one had abandoned his position. Not one had tried to run. 12 men against 300 tanks. 12 men who bought time for thousands of French soldiers to retreat. 12 men who fought a battle that history forgot, because nobody survived to tell it. But their story survived anyway, in fragments, in dusty military archives, in eyewitness accounts, and in a single inscription carved into the concrete of the fort: "Nous sommes restés." We stayed. Not because they thought they could win, but because sometimes the courage of a few becomes the shield of many. When you leave this video, remember this: history is not written by the strongest armies, but by the quiet, impossible acts of men who refuse to give up, even when the world already has.